Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Trade and Tech podcast brought to you by Gaia Dynamics. I'm Emil Stefanutti, co-founder and CEO of Gaia Dynamics. And as always, I'm joined by Tom Gould, Gaia's Chief Strategy and Compliance Officer. Tom, great to have you back.
Great to see you too. It's been an interesting week.
Yeah, and we usually bring guests onto the podcast, and this week we thought it made more sense to sit down together because over the last 5 days, as you mentioned, it's been a crazy week, and we've received the same questions from customers, brokers, importers, procurement teams, even investors. And the question is, what is actually happening out there with tariffs? Honestly, a fair question. And in 1 week, obviously, as many people know, Canada announced new 50% tariffs for Canada, and Brazil new tariffs became effective under another law. And today, the administration replaced the expiring global Section 122 surcharge with an entirely new Section 301 framework affecting 60 trading partners. So 3 announcements, 3 different legal authorities, 3 different compliance playbooks. Today, we're going to separate the headlines from reality, and hopefully Tom can leave our audience with a practical roadmap for Monday morning, right? So what should they expect when they get to work on Monday? So Tom, at a high level, what is going on? Why has this week been so confusing?
So it's a really good question. And I think a lot of it has to do with it goes back to the fact that the Supreme Court found the IEEPA tariffs unconstitutional. And when that happened, the administration, the first thing they did was they threw out this stopgap measure called Section 122, which is a law that allows the president to impose tariffs up to 15%. It only went to 10%, but the law allows up to 15%. And the law allows the tariffs to be imposed for 150 days. So one of the different things that happened with the Section 122 tariffs is when they were implemented, they had an end date of July 24th because that was 150 days after they were implemented. And so the reason I think why we've seen so much activity this week was because the Section 122 tariffs, the IEEPA tariffs were found unconstitutional. The Section 122 tariffs that were designed to replace them for a period of time were expiring. And so now we're at a point where what happens next?
Yeah, and so let's start with Canada, just so we pick one, right? And I think this caught a lot of people by surprise, I think. And, people heard 50% tariffs on Canadian goods. And sort of, I guess many assumed immediately they needed to react. And the reality is a little more nuanced. So can you walk us through what was actually announced?
Sure. So this was a new tariff that was announced using a different law. The law that was used to announce the Canadian tariffs was what's referred to as Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930. So this is a law that was passed almost 100 years ago. And an interesting thing about this law is the law actually has a provision in it that says that the president can announce new tariffs, but they don't take effect for 30 days. So some think that the 30-day delay was to allow the U.S. and Canada to negotiate during that period of time. And I think that's partially true. But if you take a look at the language of the law, it actually says that it's going to take, the tariffs can't be implemented for 30 days after the announcement. And the law, then the announcement was basically about discrimination in commercial practices. And there were actually 3 separate announcements, one saying that Canada discriminates against the United States in the dairy industry based on quotas and high tariffs. They also said that Canada is discriminating against the U.S. on alcohol because Canada stopped selling U.S. alcohol. And the discrimination is that Canada is giving preferential treatment to countries other than the United States. And the third one was on automobiles. Now, with the 3 Section 338 laws that were, proclamations that were made, the president imposed a different set of retaliatory tariffs for each of the 3. So for alcohol, most of the most of the impact is on Canadian alcohol. The dairy, most of the impact is on Canadian dairy. But for the auto provision, it applies to Canadian auto, but there were a bunch of other products that were included in the list. And the one that seems to be getting the most news is hockey sticks or hockey equipment, which somehow got added to the list.
And, looking at the news, right, Canadian Prime Minister sort of immediately say, okay, we're going to prioritize negotiating and whatnot with the U.S. government. So is this a negotiation tactic? I mean, I guess the question is this something that you think is actually going to happen in a month?
That's a hard one to predict. Is it a negotiating tactic? Certainly it is. I mean, it's clear that it's a negotiating tactic. I know I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but the Section 301 investigation that we're going to be talking about in a minute does exclude goods that are Canadian that qualify for the USMCA or the Customs Free Trade Agreement. So maybe it was seen that there was not as much leverage as the U.S. wanted under the Section 301 tariffs. And so this Section 338 tariffs might be used as a negotiating ploy.
Right. And again, this isn't in effect today, right? So companies actually have a planning window, and we'll see what happens during those negotiations and whatnot. So I guess this means this is not really about panic. It's more about preparation. And one thing that's generated a lot of questions, like, doesn't the USMCA protect Canadian products already? Like, how should companies be thinking about all of this?
Well, that's a big question. I think both Canada and Mexico have argued that the USMCA prevents the U.S. from imposing some of these tariffs. The problem is that the question would not go to a court here in the U.S., but it would go to an international tribunal of the three countries, and we just haven't gotten that far along. I think it's interesting that you mentioned, 30 days. Oh, it's good. It gives us time to plan. Things are different today from what they were historically. My recollection of back in the days when NAFTA was first negotiated or CAFTA was negotiated, we were talking in terms of years to prepare and to understand and to negotiate. And now having a tariff where we have only 30 days and thinking that that's a lot of time it's a different time than it was not too long ago.
Yeah, for sure. And so if you're importing from Canada today, like, what's the very first thing then that you would review? Like, what would you be telling people? How do they get ready for this?
Well, the first thing that they have to do is make sure that they understand the HTS classification for their products. And they need to do that because each of the three Section 338 tariffs provisions have an accompanying list of product classifications that will be subject to the new tariff. And so you need to know if your products are subject to it or if they're not. And then you need to start thinking about if they are there opportunities maybe to change the product to get a different classification that may not be on the list? So tariff engineering, something that we've talked about before. And if they're not on the list, you want to make sure that you've got rock solid proof behind that, because one of the things that I'm expecting to happen if these Section 338 tariffs and other tariffs go through is that customs is going to be looking much more closely at companies that import products in classifications that are not subject to the new tariffs, looking to see if companies are using wrong classifications as a way to get out of the tariffs. So that's why tariff classification is so important with all of these new tariff provisions.
Yeah, that makes sense. And we, at Gaia at least, we were already ready for this. So, for those that may be wondering, how do I check and how do I do this quickly and scale? We already have all of the Section 338 available to check and to validate against those codes. But moving on, right? So we just talked about Canada. Now let's move south to Brazil, right? So kind of a same result, completely different law. So at first glance, it sounds familiar, right? It's just another tariff announcement, but legally, it seems to be a completely different animal, right? So what's different between what's happening in Canada and what's happening in Brazil?
So yeah, you're right. So the big difference is the law that was used to implement the Brazil tariffs, and that's Section 301 of, and I'm forgetting which one it is, a Tariff Act from the 60s or 70s. But basically, it's a law that allows the president to impose tariffs, but there's some prerequisites. There's certain requirements that must be met before the president can impose tariffs. So the U.S. Trade Representative has to do an investigation. That includes holding public hearings. It includes asking for comments from the public. And then the U.S. Trade Representative makes a recommendation to the president, and then the president issues a proclamation that imposes the new tariffs. And so this has all been happening actually for the last few months, where there have been the hearings and the notice and comments and so forth. And just earlier this week, we saw the new tariff announced on products from Brazil, and it's most products from Brazil.
Yeah. And I guess unlike Canada, this one, like you said, is already effective. So companies aren't planning anymore. They're already paying.
Correct.
So one thing I found interesting, right? There are more than 1,200 exempted tariff lines on this. And so this isn't simply just like everything from Brazil now costs 20%, 25% more. So how do you think that importers should approach those exceptions? I mean, would you say is the same recommendation that you just gave for Canada, or is this a different animal?
It's a very similar recommendation. Again, companies need to know their classifications. They need to really have rock solid proof behind their classifications to show to customs that that is the correct classification for their product. But they also need to be careful when looking at the lists, because the different lists and the different laws of products that are subject to the tariffs and products that are exempt from the tariffs, the lists look very similar because they have a lot of very similar products in them. But they're different, and the differences are where things are critical. You need to make sure that your product, if you're importing a product from Canada and importing the same product from Brazil, for example, it may be that it's exempt from one country, but not exempt from the other. So you got to be careful there.
Now, I was looking at another kind of practical point, right? And there are in-transit provisions that could make a meaningful difference, right? For shipments are already on the water. So who should be looking at that today?
Again, it's almost too short of a window for companies to plan, but anybody that's involved in importing from these countries, whether you're a customs broker, a freight forwarder, or if you're an importer that has imports from these countries, it's really important to understand the timing and the nuances of the dates that are involved. So is it the export date? Is it the import date? Is it the entry date? And so forth. Because the different rules rely on different dates for different purposes. So the in-transit provisions generally require that the goods be shipped by ocean, so by vessel. Not so if they're shipped by air or by truck, that doesn't apply. And the goods also have to be on the last vessel from the country to the United States. So if the goods are moving from country A to country B, where they're taken off of one vessel and loaded onto another vessel, and then they're shipped to the U.S. from the second vessel, you have to look at that second vessel. And then again, there are timelines for when it has to be loaded and timelines for when it has to arrive.
Yeah. Now let's turn to what seems to be probably, right, the biggest development of this week, unless you are, of course, Canadian or bringing things from Canada or Brazil. But for the last few months, as you mentioned, companies have been living with a 10% global surcharge under Section 122. So now today, that has expired exactly as scheduled, and almost immediately was replaced, overnight with a new Section 301 framework following, the U.S. Trade Representative's forced labor investigations, right? So can you walk us through what actually changed?
Yeah, well, so one tariff went away and a new one came in place. And so it's important to think of these as two completely separate animals or two separate, tariffs, because the rules are similar, but they're different. And the differences and the nuances are what's important. So this new one was a new tariff that was imposed on 60 economies, and they use the term economies because the EU is considered one economy as opposed to 27 countries. And it imposes tariffs on these 60 countries because these 60 countries either do not have laws on their books prohibiting the use of forced labor, or they have laws on the books prohibiting the use of forced labor, but they're not properly enforcing them as far as the U.S. is concerned. And so when I look at the tariffs, I see these as being in four kind of buckets. The first bucket applies to 17 economies: Argentina, Bangladesh, Cambodia, Canada, Ecuador, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, India, Indonesia, Jordan, Malaysia, Mexico, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Trinidad and Tobago, and the United Kingdom. So if you're importing from one of those countries, you will be paying an additional 10% tariff on your product. That's 10% on top of the normal duty rate, or the MFN rate, as we call it, is what you'll be paying on imports from those countries. Now, the next bucket or group of countries receives also 10%, but their 10%, and this is only applies to the European Union and Taiwan, and these countries' 10% includes the MFN rate. So there's a couple of different ways to calculate that depending on the actual MFN rate. If the MFN rate is less than 10%, then the sum of the Section 301 tariff and the MFN rate is 10%. But if the MFN rate is more than 10%, then there is no Section 301 duty. And again, that applies to the European Union and Taiwan. And then there's three more economies, Japan, Korea, and Switzerland, that pay a 12.5% rate on their products, subject to the same minimum and maximum. If the MFN rate is below 12.5%, then they pay the difference in Section 301. And if it's more than 12.5%, the MFN is more than 12.5%, then they pay the total of the MFN rate. They don't pay any Section 301 rates. Again, Japan, Korea, and Switzerland. And then the rest of the countries, there's 38, and I'm not going to list them, they pay 12.5% plus the MFN rate.
Right. So big, important distinctions there. So although the headline may sound, if I'm understanding correctly, right? So if the headline may sound like the 10% tariff became 12.5, but that's not really what happened, right? It is a completely different legal framework, different rates, different countries, different exemptions.
Yes.
Totally, and a different enforcement basis. So I guess one question that we're hearing from brokers and customers is this actually easier to manage, or did everyone's job just become more complicated?
Yeah, everyone's job became more complicated. And it became more complicated because now you have different rates for different countries. And some countries have this complicated calculation where you have to look up one rate, and then you have to do some math to look up the other part of the rate. And in some cases, when you have one of the specific or compound duty rates, that's where the duty rate isn't based on the value, but it's based on the quantity, then you have to convert it to what it would be based on the value. So it becomes complicated. And another thing that adds another layer of complexity is that there's a whole long list of exclusions for this new Section 301 tariff. So, for example, goods that qualify under the USMCA agreement are excluded from the Section 301 tariffs from Canada or Mexico. There's a provision for tariff rate quotas for products from a few countries if they use U.S. origin cotton or man-made fiber textiles or cotton fiber. We mentioned the on-the-water provision. That's also another complexity. There's exclusions for things like civil aircraft and certain pharmaceutical products. Products that are subject to Section 232 tariffs are not subject to the Section 301 tariffs. And then there's a long list or several lists, and some of them are country specific, of other products that are either not made in sufficient quantities in the U.S., things like coffee, or things that were negotiated back in the days of IEEPA were added to a country-specific list of products that were excluded. So again, today is far more complex because you have to manage all of these exclusions.
And what about stacking? So that's always a big one that we hear. So you already mentioned, Section 232, but so how should companies think about products that were already subject to either Section 232 or even other Section 301 duties?
Yeah, well, we don't have all the answers to the questions, and that's part of the issue here as well. And that is that we know for a fact that the Section 301 duty, and this is all of them, they stack on top of the MFN duty. So does the 232. But the Section 301 does not stack on top of the 232 duties. Now, we also know that the Section 301s stack on top of each other. So if you have products from China or products from Brazil, they're going to be subject to the Section 301 forced labor tariff and the Section 301 Brazil tariff, or the Section 301 forced labor tariff and the Section 301 China tariff. What we don't know, though, is what order they need to be reported in. And is Customs going to be concerned about the order that they're reported in? We're guessing you do the oldest first and then the next one. And we're hoping that Customs isn't going to make a firm decision. But this is something that brokers and software companies are struggling with as we speak, because there's just no answers. So they're going to have to take a guess and hope that they're right. And if they're wrong, they may have to go back and correct a bunch of entries.
Yeah, I know some of our product people are definitely looking into these and making exactly those calls. So going back to Section 122, right? And because there was also a ruling about that, is there anything else that people need to be thinking about 122? Is there because of that ruling?
Sure. So first of all, if there is a case in the Court of International Trade where the Court of International Trade found that the Section 122 tariffs are unconstitutional. That's now in the appellate courts at the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, and we're waiting for an answer from them. My guess is whatever the appellate court decides, it's probably going to go to the Supreme Court like the IEEPA tariffs did. And if the Supreme Court finds that those are unconstitutional, I think that we might see another phase of the system that Customs built called CAPE, which is what's used for companies to request refunds of the unconstitutionally collected IEEPA tariffs. So we could see a new phase of that for the Section 122 tariffs. And so what's really important right now is for companies to be tracking these tariffs, to make sure that they know what they've paid and they know what's out there, and to speak to counsel, speak to their brokers about should they be filing a protest, should they be filing a lawsuit in the Court of International Trade to preserve their rights. And some should, some will make the decision not to or to wait. But those are all decisions that companies need to be thinking about today.
Yeah, definitely things don't seem to be getting any easier anytime soon. Let's sort of zoom out for a minute then. So we've talked about Canada, we've talked about Brazil. Now this Section 301 action, but maybe if you could summarize for our audience, because we've talked about a lot of different things. Can you compare these three actions and sort of different legal authorities, policy objectives, the planning horizons, and why all of these ends up, being something that matters for people?
I think it all goes back to the America First trade policy that was implemented on day one of the Trump administration, where the Trump administration decided that they wanted to use tariffs as a way to negotiate better deals with trading partners. And that's what we're dealing with. And, it seems that a lot of the tariffs are being used as ways of gaining leverage on countries to gain concessions from those countries. And in doing so, it's adding a lot of complexity to an already complex environment. Now, we also have happening at the same time is a significant increase in enforcement. Now, you know that I've been involved in the industry for many years. And one of the things that I've seen throughout my career is that there's been like a pendulum that's swung back and forth when it comes to kind of the primary focus of the administration as well as the government agencies that regulate trade. in the early days of NAFTA in the early 1990s, we saw a shift towards having importers take a lot more responsibility for their own compliance. And then in the early 2000s, after 9/11, we saw a shift towards supply chain security. And in both of those shifts, we saw the government taking a lighter position as far as enforcement was concerned. They were pushing companies to do self-enforcement and self-reporting, and they were being lenient on things like penalties, and they weren't digging into a lot of compliance issues. Well, the pendulum has clearly swung in the other direction today, where the government has placed a significant emphasis on enforcement. And we saw that a few weeks ago with the president's executive order ordering the various different government agencies, including customs that regulate trade, to step up their enforcement, to increase penalties, they also got more resources, more money, more people, more tools to help companies with enforcement. One of the things that customs is doing right now, and I actually think this is a smart thing, is they're using artificial intelligence tools to help them identify obvious errors in the data that are signs of compliance issues. And so one of the things that I'm saying to companies and talking with companies about today is how important it is for companies to be using those tools themselves to make sure that their claims are all compliant. One of the calls I'm getting these days a lot is companies saying, hey, I filed for a refund of the IEPA duties in Cape, and instead of getting a refund, I got a duty bill. And why did that happen? Well, a lot of times it happened because the company made an error and they did something wrong. And now that companies are asking for refunds, customs is looking and saying, you know what? We're going to send you a duty bill because you got it wrong. And so the enforcement seems to be the message of the day. And the way today to manage compliance and prevent enforcement actions is to use modern technologies such as AI technologies like Gaia Dynamics.
So now let's make this practical, right? Let's talk about Monday morning. And let's say you're the VP of Global Trade and you've listened to this podcast maybe over the weekend. And what's the first thing now that you do before lunch?
Check the news. I got to see what's happening and what's happened in the last few hours. And it's unfortunate because it used to be that we'd had months or years to plan for changes. Today, it seems like we have hours to plan for changes. So I think the first thing that I'm doing is, checking the news to see what's changed.
Yeah, and I guess, I would add maybe auditing your exposure by country and by
Absolutely.
HTS code. And because definitely not assuming that your landed cost model from June still reflects reality now in July or
Well,
today, right?
you're absolutely right. You need to be looking at your cost models for a lot of different reasons. You need to make sure that you've done things right, because in other words, you've got the right classifications and the right tariffs applied. But also, you need to look and see what other unintended consequences come from those decisions,
Mhm.
right? If you are now paying a much higher percentage of your company's revenue in tariffs than you were in the past, then it may be time to review your entire financial strategy, because you may have kind of ignored the tariffs in the past because they were just such a small part of your financials. But today, now that they're a bigger part of the financials, you need to consider that. And that's not a straight and simple calculation. Again, you need to have tools to help you make sure that you're doing it right and you're using all the right numbers in your calculations.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I guess maybe reviewing your entry timing, right? Especially if you have shipments moving during this transition, and kind of document what you made, the decisions you made.
Absolutely.
I guess reviewing Canadian sourcing and definitely not assuming that USMCA preference alone will solve the problem after August 19th. Review Brazilian shipments. I mean, there's a big to-do list, I guess, for many people I guess to your point earlier, build that flexibility because this seems to be something that will keep happening. We just don't know when is the next big swing and what exactly it's going to bring. Many of the people listening to this already know a lot of these things, are experts, but we get a lot of questions of people that are really confused, and it doesn't seem to be something that will change anytime soon. And that's exactly why, I guess, for everybody, we wanted to record this episode right away and not to create more noise, but hopefully to reduce some of it. And I hope we're able to accomplish that. And so if you're responsible for customs or sourcing or procurement or global trade, I guess the advice is simple. Look at your own data, use tools that can help you do that at scale and more efficiently and quickly so that you can understand your exposure, model different scenarios and make decisions based on facts and not just headlines. There is plenty of headlines today that make it even more confusing. So, Tom, any last words to our listeners?
Well, what my wife said to me and what I'm saying to people is enjoy your weekend. Monday's going to be a fun day. Next week's going to be a fun week.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Tom. This was very, very interesting and always very enriching. And thanks, everybody, for joining us on another episode of the Trade and Tech Podcast. If you found today's discussion helpful, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And if you have questions you like for us to tackle in future episodes, we'll love to hear from you. So thank you, and we'll see you next time.